The United States, I argue, has compelling and enduring foreign policy interests in Africa. From opening new markets of trade to strengthening partnerships for counterterrorism operations, both Democratic and Republican U.S. presidential administrations over time have partnered with African governments and also with regional institutions to save African lives, to improve African economies, and to stop African wars. And they've done so on the premise that helping Africa to prosper has also served America's interest, and the United States has often enjoyed the privileged position of being the so-called partner of choice on a range of issues. But as the continent evolves and as new actors emerge, I argue that the United States is losing its status as a partner of choice on a wide variety of matters, and that indeed it is vitally important in this first quarter of the 21st century to take a new look at the nature of Africa's emerging partnerships. A number of things have characterized the nature of U.S. engagement to the continent over the years. During the Cold War, for example, and for the first decade or so of the post-Cold War era, the United States adopted an approach of a so-called anchor state approach to engagement with the continent, meaning emphasizing bilateral relations with countries that were believed to be key influencers to their entire regions, countries like Nigeria, the DRC, Ethiopia, Uganda, and South Africa. And while there have been firms that have been involved in a variety of extractive industries, and those firms tended to dominate U.S. economic engagement in Africa, that was at a time when official development assistance tended to be larger than American private sector assistance on the continent. But that is changing. As we all know, for some years now, private sector engagement has outstripped official development assistance in Africa. And while Africa's engagement with non-African partners beyond the United States, formally in decades prior, tended to be dominated by former colonial powers like Britain and France, we also know, as has been noted, that there have been a number of other actors that are beginning to emerge, China being chief amongst them, but certainly not being limited. The development of the sorts of changes that are happening on the continent has been marked by, I would argue, 4 different factors. The first factor has been the growth of many of Africa's economies. In May 2000, The Economist magazine labeled Africa, quote, the hopeless continent. By 2011, it had changed its assessment and proclaimed what was the hopeless continent to, quote, Africa rising. The surprising increase in African economic growth began to change the image of the continent from one in which conflict and disease were rife and in need of outside assistance to one where business could be done and profits could be made. The second major development, changing the way in which many are looking at Africa, has been the increase and diversification in actors engaging in commerce on the continent. As I mentioned, China is chief amongst these external actors. And by 2016, China had become the largest trading partner of Africa, the largest foreign job creator in Africa, and the leading source of foreign direct investment dollars into the continent. However, despite the fact that Chinese companies are involved in building seaports in Djibouti and airports in Togo, textile factories in South Africa, and car factories in Ethiopia, they are not the only non-African and non-traditional colonial power engaging on the continent. Turkey is another example. Between 2003 and 2017, topping over $17 billion in 2017. Turkish Airlines has expanded to cover 52 destinations in 33 African countries, and Ankara now has over 40 diplomatic missions across the continent. India, similarly, has dramatically expanded its economic engagement on the continent. Indian African trade has mushroomed from $5.3 billion in 2001 to over $70 billion in 2013. And both in the case of India and Turkey, these are not simply the results of decisions by individual private sector actors, but rather the deliberate decisions of the sovereign states of Turkey and India to help improve and grow their engagements on the continent. The third major trend has been the maturing of African regional and continental institutions, and in particular, the African Union. The host city of the African Union, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, is now the third largest diplomatic city in the world, as countries as far away as Argentina and Australia establish joint missions both to Ethiopia and to the AU. The African Union has proved itself ready to engage in a host of issues, from the fight against Ebola to rethinking and reshaping the International Criminal Court, to taking exceptional steps to help draft and create the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. And while the organization is by no means perfect and certainly has its own Byzantine processes, the breadth of creativity with which the AU engages on behalf of its member states has led to, I would argue, dramatic increase in how it is seen, the effectiveness of how it's seen by other non-African entities. The European Union, for example, has dramatically strengthened and deepened its cooperation with the EU. China now has a separate mission to the African Union, separate from its mission to the Ethiopia. Japan is soon to follow suit, as will other countries. And then the fourth has been the increasing priority given to counterterrorism measures that has also helped to broaden the sorts of actors that are engaged in Africa. While the attacks of September 11th, 2001 was the searing moment for counterterrorism operations and the importance of counterterrorism in the United States, arguably terrorist attacks that occurred in 2010 in Uganda and 2013 in Nairobi had a similar impact on the importance of counterterrorism and what it means to protecting African lives. And as a result, a number of things, from the creation of the G5 Sahel Initiative to the Nouakchott and Djibouti processes, have all created environments where other sovereign actors like the Emirates, like Saudi Arabia, like Qatar, and others have found ways to engage in a host of counterterrorism operations across Africa and thus increase their ability to serve as strategic partners for Africa. Now, 10 different strategic partnerships that the African Union has with other sovereign states. So much so that the African Union has had to create an entire directorate, the Partnerships for Directorate, as a means of managing all of these various partnerships. Security is perhaps one of the places where this has grown most dramatically and where the nature of these partnerships has become much more diverse. For example, the Chinese, which have traditionally been loath to engage in military operations beyond their immediate region, now have over 2,400 peacekeepers serving in 6 UN operations across Africa. The tiny African nation of Djibouti in East Africa is now the home of the largest number of foreign military bases of any country in the world, as it hosts troops from the United States, France, Italy, Japan, and China, with Saudi Arabia rumored to follow suit shortly. In December 2017, as a result of the proliferation of all these partnerships, the African Union Commission decided that it needed to take a strategic look at its strategic partnerships and begin to ask the question, indeed, what does it really want out of these partnerships and how does it begin to address those? So in December of 2017, the African Union Commission held a retreat in Cairo to evaluate the data and prepare recommendations for the Assembly of Heads of State of the African Union to determine which of these partnerships should be supported, which should be ended, and which proposed partnerships should be started, and which should be declined. They came up with a series of criteria, the so-called Cairo criteria, by which to evaluate these. Those criteria are: first, putting substance before politics; second, moving from donor-recipient relationship to equitable partnerships in these sorts of engagements; third, to focus on partnerships that develop tangible and measurable results; and fourth, to look to partnerships that deliver strategic outcomes, or outcomes that really have the potential to change the entirety of the continent. The Assembly of Heads of State will receive the results of the Cairo retreat at their semi-annual Heads of State Summit in Mauritania in July of this year, during which they are expected to take decisions about the future of the African Union's external partnerships. The point of saying all of this is that, from my perspective, as an American citizen, as an American patriot, but also somebody who is passionate about Africa and passionate about U.S.-African partnership, the United States must take note of these trends. That must take note of the fact that Africa is changing. It is changing quite dramatically, that other actors are keen to see this engagement, and that Africans are not waiting for the United States to decide how and when they want to engage. It is thus vitally important that the United States change its approach with some degree of rapidity. In my consultations across the continent in the last 2 years, I have noted a number of things which suggest that African officials are very concerned about the lack of U.S. engagement. The first, and they cite a series of things to demonstrate their point of view. The first is they note that as we stand here today, on June 12th, 2018, no Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs is yet to be appointed by the Trump administration. They have, finally, nominated a distinguished former U.S. ambassador, Ambassador Tibor Nagy, who I understand will have his confirmation hearing this week before the United States Senate, and should all go well, hopefully will be confirmed in relatively short order. But that still leaves nearly 2 years into the Trump presidency, where President Trump has not designated a senior government official for the purpose of coordinating Africa policy and engaging with senior African leaders. The second thing that is often pointed out by African interlocutors, and it's related to this first point, is a perceived lack of high-level engagement with Africa, especially when compared with the engagement they see from other sovereign non-African partners. Of course, we note that there have been some high-level visits. USAID Administrator Mark Green, for example, visited Sudan in August 2017. U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Ambassador Nikki Haley, visited Ethiopia, South Sudan, and the DRC just 1 month prior, or just 2 months later in October 2017. And of course, there was the famous visit of Secretary of State Rex Tillerson to Ethiopia, Djibouti, Chad, Kenya, and Nigeria in March of 2018. However, this latter visit, meant to be something of a demonstration of how important Africa is to the Trump administration, turned out to be anything but, when Secretary Tillerson was fired before that visit even concluded. Thus, leading many Africans to wonder what exactly the United States thinks about Africa, and in fact, taking that one particular, the fact that Secretary Tillerson was fired, as frankly the best evidence of the Trump administration's attitude towards Africa, generally speaking. While this has been happening, other countries have been engaging quite robustly. For example, China received African Union Commission Chairman Moussa Faki Mahamat in Beijing in February 2018 in advance of the upcoming FOCAC conference in September of this year, and during which they agreed that the African Union and China would focus on 5 major projects for China to help finance and support the Program for Infrastructure Development for Africa, which, as you know, is the program that the African Union has developed of some 50+ infrastructure projects that are essential for the economic development of the continent. The third major issue that African political elites tend to cite is that the priorities for Africa are not sufficiently aligned with the partnership priorities of the United States. Agenda 2063 is the continent's plan for its development through the middle of the 21st century. More importantly, it is a document with high political salience that is routinely cited by African officials in policy discussions at the continental, regional, and national levels. Yet the United States has not meaningfully adjusted its development assistance, its political engagement, or its diplomatic strategy to take into account the importance of Agenda 2063 to Africa and its relevance to African partnerships. The same might also be said for the Silencing the Gun initiatives, which is an initiative to help stop Africa's wars by 2020, which is something that is rarely, if ever, mentioned by senior U.S. officials in terms of their engagement. And as one senior African official told me privately, quote, "The Americans are in Africa not for us, but for themselves." The final issue, which must be said to address the elephant in the room, was President Trump's vile 2018 insult of Africa, of all African states, in the most vile terms. It's an insult that continues to rankle in many African countries and many African capitals. It was only, in fact, the last-minute letter from President Trump to the Assembly of the Heads of State in January 2018 that prevented the entire African Union from recalling all of their ambassadors from Washington in protest. Let me begin to conclude by saying this, and I say this with all sincerity. It gives me no pleasure as a loyal and faithful citizen of my country to have to find cause to criticize it, especially on foreign soil. And yet, we must face the reality that the nature of changes on this continent are profound, that the nature of changes in Africa will help define what the international community as a whole will be talking about through the middle of the 21st century, and that the United States, as a matter of policy, is not yet adjusted to this challenge. And yet, there are many things that can be done, indeed that the Trump administration could itself decide to do, even at this late date, to begin to change course. And there are three broad things. One, the U.S. must reorient its engagement to be more relevant on a regional and multilateral basis in Africa. Two, wherever possible, it should align its own interests and objectives to those identified by African countries and multilateral institutions. Three, it must identify circumstances where African partnerships with other non-African countries or entities are contrary to U.S. interests, and also must identify those places where such partnerships are in support of U.S. interests, and take steps, programmatic steps in particular, to follow. In closing, let me say this, that assessing power and influence in international affairs is always a tricky business. It is more art than science, and more subjective than objective. Nevertheless, one can reasonably argue that the United States is rapidly losing political influence in Africa, both bilaterally and multilaterally. This is not only because of a perceived drift in U.S. policy towards Africa, but also because other actors are increasing their engagement in ways that both advance their own interests and that support African governments and organizations. Africa is not standing still while the United States government contemplates how it should engage. The gains that other partners are making will eventually constrain the options available to the United States to play a decisive role in developments in Africa in a manner that supports its own interests as well as the priorities of African countries. The United States must act strategically and swiftly to adjust its approach to a changing continent. Other countries are already doing so, and America must not be left behind.